This week, Alex Furlam and Rachel Ball talk about the relationship between reading, writing, and oracy.
Literacy and oracy are massively interlinked. I don't think that we can separate them completely. I think it's impossible to talk about the scaffolding of one without touching upon the interplay of the other.
Explore the keys to scaffolding literacy.
And that's something that we should really kind of celebrate. So within the classroom, we want our teachers to be really to continue that motivation and that sense of success.
Make a case for oracy to become a central pillar of our pupils' experience of school.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Rachel, but I don't remember being taught my teacher training about oracy. And I don't remember it coming into my teacher training in my CPD programme in my school until probably about 2017.
And I am, for the final time, for now, recording outside.
We have got to that Bay Cymru on the 27th of September, with the proceeds going back to Belinda again.
Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time-poor but enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. This week, I'm going to explore oracy, literacy, and scaffolding with Alex Furlam and Rachel Ball.
Alex and Rachel, it's great to have you here again. It's been a while.
Thank you so much for having us again.
Yeah, it's nice to be back. Thank you.
Do you guys remember when you were last on talking about scaffolding?
No, actually. I know it was a while ago, but...
Yeah, it was a good while ago. It must have been this time last year, maybe, was it?
You're right, 24th of May or 25th of May, 2024.
Wow, this is going to become an annual thing now.
That's why I'm a historian, because I remembered me dates.
Yes, I've been looking forward to the scaffolding, in fact, for quite a long time. So it's great to have the chance to talk to you this time. Not about scaffolding in general, but about scaffolding literacy and oracy. And so my first question, I'm going to try and draw on what I've read from the book so far to draw my questions. And you describe literacy as the bedrock of the curriculum and say reading, writing, and oracy are symbiotic. How did that conviction shape the layout of the 3 literacy chapters? And what did you choose to leave out?
It's important to say that literacy and oracy are massively interlinked. I don't think that we can separate them completely. I think it's impossible to talk about the scaffolding of one without touching upon the interplay of the other. For example, how we can write better if we're not reading rich texts or discussing and incubating ideas with peers, then our writing isn't going to get stronger. And likewise, how can we read better if we're not exposed to rich dialogue with a wide range of vocabulary included within it? So this is why we felt it was really important to have these 3 sections side by side, kind of like an iconic trio that are different but also interconnected. So I guess the way I'm trying to phrase it is it's kind of like the Sanderson sisters. You can have the Sanderson sisters without Winifred. You can have Buffy the Vampire Slayer without Willow. So effectively, they are, very unique to themselves, but they are kind of an iconic trio. So this led our drive to have a flow of these 3 chapters together, which are dedicated to reading, then writing, and then oracy, with explicit vocabulary instruction woven through it. But we very much interlink and highlight the connection between them. So even when we're talking about reading, we're talking about the interplay with oracy and writing. And from the start, we knew it was really important to include that kind of sequencing of them, but also within that case studies from different ages and stages, as we wanted to recognise that a variety of practitioners would be accessing our book. And so we consciously sought out educators who are able to share effective literacy and oracy practice that would enable readers to hone in on how to scaffold for their key stage, but then also access what other key stages do in order to better understand the progression of those skills across time, such as writing. I think in terms of what we leave out, Rachel was privy to my many, many periods of despair and meltdowns and voice notes about what to include and what not to include. And as always, we're both historians. And so, if we can say it in 50 words, we'll say it in 500. So it was always going to be a challenge to how we could succinctly get across kind of the key aspects of it. So in the end, after kind of much kind of conversation, we decided that, we can't include it all. And in fact, there have been whole books which have been dedicated to reading, writing, and oracy. And in fact, Nikki Sullivan, has her book on oracy coming out for Inner Drive round about later in the year. So rather, what we wanted to get across was just really pinpointing the key theory around literacy and oracy and scaffolding, and the research that sits behind how to scaffold those skills, and then zoom in on a few key strategies which will then prompt readers to further explore what we've discussed using the reflection pages and the work and educators that we've cited as kind of jumping off points to look further.
I think, yeah, just to add to that, but perhaps like stepping back a stage, that we thought it was super important to include these chapters. I think there's an argument to say you could have had a book about scaffolding that maybe just had one chapter on literacy, or actually didn't dive into it at all and kind of went, that's something completely different. But for us, it was hugely important because it does unlock everything else. And we kind of had this debate about the two sides of the coin for literacy. So on the one hand, the book focuses on scaffolding strategies within literacy. So for scaffolding in reading, scaffolding in writing, scaffolding in oracy. But on the other hand, it is also a scaffold in itself to access the curriculum. So successful literacy is going to unlock everything else. And so, yeah, I think Alex is right. There was a big discussion about what we focus on, what we leave out. And we did decide to break it down into those 3 distinct chapters, but with interweaving throughout. And I think Alex does a superb job of kind of narrating that throughout the 3 chapters.
I totally agree. And I think, yeah, that desire to write down everything absolutely within your mind is a very prevalent when we're writing a book. And the reason I ask is because I think you've done it with great skill. You've chosen sort of this very clear pathway for anyone who's reading. Like I would consider myself relative novice with oracy, and there's still a lot of reading for me to do. But even from the sort of the quick read that I've done, I got a good sense of the story you guys were trying to tell. But it does sort of beg the question. I may have missed it, but there doesn't seem to be a whole 3 chapters on mathematics. Is that an intentional decision?
Well, I mean, we were waiting for the Oracle himself to write it, Kieran. So, why would we do the heavy lifting of the Oracle himself?
I mean, that's the correct answer probably, but I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon.
I mean, Kieran, bearing in mind that I still count on my fingers, and I thought that noon was 6 p.m. at night until I was 32 years old. I don't think I'm the right person to write 3 chapters on scaffolding in mathematics. So, yeah.
Wow, I've not heard that one. Do you know where that misconception came from? Just from
noon just sounds really kind of like moon and stuff. And then when somebody explained afternoon, it kind of then became really clear. I missed a job application deadline as a result of that.
No, it must be some sort of Northumbrian tradition. I know they got a strong sort of Viking tradition up there, so maybe it's from that.
And save my idiocy.
You write that the key to scaffolding literacy is to know the barriers, and I think you advocate for diagnostic assessments beyond generic reading age tests. What sort of classroom routines turn those diagnoses or diagnostic tests into day-to-day teaching actions rather than data that gathers dust in the cupboard or whatever?
One thing is really kind of being clear and explicit with all of staff about the process that the children undertake in order for us to gather this data. We shouldn't have our literacy leads as like magicians pulling a rabbit out of a hat. So for me, I think that kind of comes back to how the data is shared, because I think that's really important. If it's just data which is going to be added to Sims or ClassArts and that's it, then we may as well not carry them out effectively, because it just sits there as kind of data in a system. And so what teachers need to support them to understand what to do with that data is quality chunk sequence CPD that explores the different reading barriers that exist and how the tests help to illuminate those. And they need to be given time to plan effectively for students with those barriers as well. And I think that's often the part that we forget. I think once, we've got that data and we've got that kind of quality CPD that sits behind it, prior preparation to the lesson is obviously very important. And so your planning routine rather than your classroom routines needs to be something which is kind of part of what we discuss. We're not just planning for the delivery of contents and skills and what we're teaching, but we're also planning for the literacy domain, because both of these will put pressure on working memory. And so we've got to plan with both in mind, and therefore we've got to plan our scaffolding for both in mind as well. And I think that's where John Eaton's blog is really useful, in terms of how he outlines how an advance of a lesson will anticipate the barriers that students may experience that will hinder learning. And that might include things like tricky curriculum areas that are usually fraught with misconceptions. Like for me, when I teach Weimar Constitution in Germany, like they always struggle with that. So I have to really kind of anticipate in advance what the barriers are. It might be using your formative assessment from previous lessons that indicate the scaffolding for some students in the forthcoming lesson that's going to be needed. But this also includes looking at your various different data sets for students, such as pupil passports, attendance data, and of course, reading age data as well. So by looking at these reading ages and knowing exactly what the barrier is, whether that's phonics or fluency, and how many words they can read per common minute and that sort of thing, we're then able to better anticipate the barriers that students may experience when then reading something like an interpretation in history or Hamlet in English. When then in the classroom, the routines that can then turn to day-to-day actions will be ensuring that reading is appropriately chunked and interwoven with chunks for understanding, which will then provide the feedback to you as a teacher about whether you need to adapt your teaching and provide additional scaffolding. And I think that really aligns with recent blogs which have come out by people such as Peps McRae, talking about cognitive similarity, in terms of we shouldn't just see this as something we consider for weaker readers. What constitutes good teaching for SEND and EAL and low literacy readers constitutes good teaching for all. And we should be applying this mindset. And then I think finally, from me, from a literacy leader point of view, I think it's important for them to really over communicate and continue to raise the profile of reading ages. It shouldn't be that it's information that's just shared at the start of the year and then it's kind of forgotten about. You should share the information at regular points, because testing will take place throughout the year. Updates and briefing of key students are in CPD with updated score headlines, students who are now entering intervention groups, but also I think celebrating their successes. So we've been using Lexonics Advanced and Lexonics Leap. And this year we've got 46 months reading progress. And that's something that we should really kind of celebrate. So within the classroom, we want our teachers to be really, to continue that motivation and that sense of success. And that I think will help elevate within teachers' consciousness the importance of reading ages when planning, and then also adapting live in the lesson as well.
Yeah, just picking up on a couple of Alex's points there. I think as schools generally, we've got much better at sharing reading ages with teachers, but that Alex is absolutely right. That can just be like a number on your Sims or, in your class charts, and isn't really thought about or dug down any deeper. So I think, first of all, that really explicit teaching for teachers about what's involved in that reading age assessment, what kind of skills go into it and are measured. Like Alex has said, there's a varied skill set there that is needed, whether it is phonics, understanding of vocabulary, reading fluency, and teaching teachers about that, I do think is important. And then also that understanding that just like prior attainment of a student, reading age can improve massively. It's not fixed in time, so we need to keep revisiting that. And then adapting, scaffolding your lesson with that in mind, just thinking of that just like any other barrier that a student might face. It might be that they have been off for a series of lessons and have got low prior knowledge before you come to that topic, or it might be that they have a low working memory and they struggle to get started with a task. Those are the kind of barriers that you should be aware of that your students have, and reading ages are just very similar. You think of that, bear that in mind, and then adapt your lesson as you need to. So, if it is vocabulary that is a particular issue with students in your classes, then you would do extra work to provide those really great glossaries alongside, guided reading structures perhaps that have the keywords defined as you go along, so that students' working memories are not split going to a glossary on a separate page and then back to the reading of the text itself. Things like that can be massively helpful.
Carefully consider your CPD. So we've already talked about it being chunked and sequential. It should be throughout the year. It's not kind of like confetti CBT where like we've done a session and like that's it, ticked off for the year and on to the next thing. And I think that's where you can really look at whatever platforms or instructional or responsive coaching platforms that you use as well, and align that with that kind of aspect of your CPD. So for us next year, when we're looking forward, we use platforms such as Step Lab. So when we are kind of focusing in on our oracy and kind of literacy kind of areas, it'll be kind of saying, this is why we're doing it, and like aligning that with the data and stuff like that, and really linking that to the action steps and the development that then people will take, because what we know is going to lead to that, those classroom routines of really effective scaffolding of reading, writing, and oracy is going to be the opportunity to see it modelled, to rehearse it, and then to carry out deliberate practice.
Did you find when you were preparing and sort of, because obviously, like Neil did a case study as part of one of the chapters, did you find any difference or similarities between primary and secondary colleagues that you spoke to about this? Because I'm almost imagining the secondary audience with a real need to take on board a lot of these messages are things that really you would hope would be sorted in primary kind of thing. What were the conversations like? Were there any was there overlap, or was there a distinction between the two groups?
What we found was kind of useful about it is when you're a primary teacher, you're an expert at 12 different subjects and you're teaching the students all the time. So you're going to see writing across the piece of different subjects. And so you're going to be able to kind of look at not only their writing, but their handwriting and their reading and their oracy skills across the broad range. And so that comes with its strengths in terms of being able to have a kind of better understanding of general writing development skills and taking them through the process of kind of drafting and editing and all that sort of stuff. But then it also comes with an additional challenge for primary in terms of, well, what does writing look like in history, and what does speaking like a historian look like? And then if we go to secondary, we've got the kind of, yes, we can kind of hone in on what that means to read like a historian, write like a historian, etc. But then if you've only got them for one 55-minute lesson a week, then it's that kind of that gap between actually and how much extended writing they can do within that time, and how you have that balance of the content and the development of literacy, which are, interwoven, like as we are teaching about, I'm going to go with Elizabeth I, religious settlement. We will be reading about it, we will be talking about it, and then we'll go on to kind of like write about it. And it's that kind of interplay and that kind of balance, which, because we can't just move on into a second hour of it, we've got to kind of, kind of meet the curriculum needs at that point. But I think what's really nice is you can quite clearly see that there is similar thinking appropriate for key stages, but actually for me as someone who teaches key stage 3 upwards, I've got children who I know will benefit from me learning about key stage 1 and key stage 2 because they are perhaps still at that level. And whilst it is, I'm teaching to the top and expecting them to do 12 markers and 16 markers in year 10 and stuff like that, the lessons that I can learn from people like Neil and from Eve and Emma will help me to better understand the suite of scaffolding techniques which I can deploy for those individual students.
Whenever I talk to secondary heads of department for maths, I always talk, because it's very common for issues in maths in secondary to be plugged in with the year 5 maths. And I sort of said to them, actually, guys, you got to go to early years in year 1, and to make sure that sort of number sense and that those fundamental like arithmetic skills are in place and stuff. So it feels like there's a lot of overlap between those subjects.
Mm-hmm.
And it actually feeds nicely, your response feeds nicely into my follow-up, which is everyone in the secondary school responsible for this, or will there be individuals within the school? I mean, I feel like I know what the answer is going to be, but I'm just really nosy to find out what the ideal scenario might be.
I mean, Kieran, this is suggesting that you haven't read the first line of the 3 literacy and oracy chapters, which is, we are all teachers of literacy. For shame on you. So you should have it memorized by now. We are all responsible. Like, it might be that some people in secondary have a greater amount of curriculum time, but we are all responsible. If we look at the EEF disciplinary literacy guidance, we all have a role to play, because mathematicians write, scientists write. And so whilst it is, I think, when you're looking at your literacy and oracy strategies, there can be common principles and approaches in terms of different things, like teacher-led model reading. You can have that as a common kind of approach across the school, and reciprocal reading, you can have it as a common approach across the school. And likewise, you might say that actually, some of the strategies from the writing revolution are really kind of effective. It's got to then be driven through the lens of the discipline, so that we are really making sure that it's purposeful to the curriculum that's being delivered, and we are really engaging them with, high quality texts about science, about maths, about computer science, and all those sorts of things. And I think we've got to celebrate and elevate those kind of differences. So yeah, absolutely, we are all responsible. And I think hopefully I'm noticing more and more, so it's become less, it's the responsibility of the literacy lead or the English department or history, because they do a lot of writing. Because I can't think of any real reason why we wouldn't want our students to be able to write as best as they can, read as best as they can, and speak as best as they can, because in the end we got into this to make them incredibly well-rounded global citizens who are prepared for the future workplace. And that means writing, reading, and being able to, as Jeff Barton says, like disagree agreeably, and that sort of thing. So yeah, I would, in my context and my ethos, is that everyone is absolutely responsible.
I mean, you say shame, but what I was doing there was skillfully setting you up to say something that I thought was really important from the book. So you're letting the listeners in behind the curtain. So I'm pretty sure it was
Well, I
highlighted
expect
in
you
the
to be
copy I
wearing a
had.
t-shirt wearing it next time. I want a t-shirt with "We are all teachers of literacy." You can change it to numeracy as well.
And mine will say I'm only a teacher of numeracy or mathematics. You say that oracy is the poor relative of literacy and insist that it must become an integral pillar after COVID in particular. What systemic shifts, might be curriculum, PD, are required for that to happen?
I think it's a fair comment that I made. Whilst oracy is most certainly not a new thing, I don't think, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Rachel, but I don't remember being taught my teacher training about oracy. And
So
I don't remember it coming into my teacher training, I mean, in my CPD program in my school until probably about 2017. And it was through the work of Voice 21. So, I think that there is now a far greater focus on oracy in some schools, and that we've seen that really kind of increase from, I think, we saw a slight elevation 2015 onwards with obviously the work of Voice 21. And then we had COVID, which obviously outlined, the fact that for a long time children weren't talking. They were, sat behind computer screens and that sort of thing. And it obviously raised the profile of how we need to get them to communicate. So I think there exist now pockets of it, but certainly far less back then. And I think prior to COVID, there wasn't really anything centrally driven by government or teacher training providers. So I think following COVID and the inauguration of the new government, alongside the launch of organisations such as the Oracy Commission, there is now a far greater appreciation and awareness of the importance of oracy within schools. But I think there's still a lot of work for systemic systems to shift. I think that awareness is there and that understanding that we need to be kind of looking at it. But I think that for us to take it beyond an intent, beyond a vision, we need to really be looking more carefully at the what, how, and why. So effectively the implementation of it. And that's where I think there's still quite a lot of work still to do. So I think there still exists like a number of issues, which means that these shifts have not yet happened. So I think you'll get questions such as, well, when can we fit in opportunities to talk? Because I think in some cases it is still seen as a bolt-on additional thing. And when you've got a crowded curriculum and finite teaching time, oh, I've got to put in a talk task as if it's something additional to add in. And then I think, another question is things like, how can I make sure that the talk is purposeful? That fear of paired and group talk, particularly if you are battling with behaviour, how do you make sure that they're talking about the content rather than what they're having for dinner or who was on Love Island last night? I think the other thing is some may feel like in terms of CPD priorities, is this the thing that we should be focusing on, because we've got behaviour, we've got attendance, we've got send. So I think there's some winning of hearts and minds about how actually them being able to articulate themselves better will benefit all students, including SEND students, that actually, behaviour can be improved via, how they talk to us, how we talk to them, and we create those kind of routines for talk and kind of what's acceptable. And because part of oracy is learning to talk, as well as the content of talk. I think some, such as me back in 2017, I was like, well, we already do this. And actually, if we'd been given the skills to audit or evaluate what we were doing, then I'd understand actually we probably were to some extent, but not massively. And we weren't teaching kind of like how to talk as a historian. And I think some other things that people might kind of have is it's the next fad. And that's why I would really, really please say do not do things like no pen days, or insist that, each subject has a rule for talk, or host a CPD session and carry out a learning walk or observation a few weeks later, expecting to see kind of like crystallized talk happening, because that will make it a gimmick, and that will not lead to that shift because it will be seen as that fad. And as McRae Step Lab very carefully demonstrated, and I mentioned in my last response, is they need to have the opportunities for modelling, rehearsal, and deliberate practice. And I think the last thing that could prevent it from being a systemic shift is that oracy, we just give them oracy sentence stems. Here's some ways that you start a conversation, and that's the only kind of like scaffold. So I think what would help to support it, not I've done the glass half full, I'll do the half empty, sorry, I'll do the glass half full. So I think what would really help to push that seismic shift would be, I think, working with staff to establish a vision for oracy. They don't need another soundbite, another gobbet, which is received and put on a website, and that they've got to learn verbatim. In the end, I think kind of really talking about what oracy is and why we're doing it, and co-establishing that vision and how that Venn diagrams with the curriculum and with teaching and learning and with pastoral, so that they can see that it is pretty much kind of woven through everything. And I think that might help to dispel some of the myths and misconceptions behind it. I always come up with some kind of food kind of analogy. And so the way that I think about it is that, when I'm talking about it with staff is I'll say that the curriculum is like a Christmas pudding, effectively. It's this kind of like, really kind of wonderful kind of cake. But in order to make it rich and to make it powerful, you're constantly injecting and infusing it with oracy and reading and writing and all those sorts of things. And that's what makes it kind of what it is. That's what makes it accessible, that you're not choking on the crumbs because you've got that to kind of moisten it and stuff like that. So I think the staff see that more as that they are, intrinsically interlinked rather than separate component ingredients just kind of stacked up that you've got to shove into a lesson somehow. So I think once you've got that kind of vision and you've got that more so level of kind of buy-in, I think there's a clear articulation within that about what we say when we're talking about oracy. So we're talking about learning to talk, we're learning about learning through talk, and we're learning about language. And Ambition Institute really do succinctly kind of summarize that up, and we've got that in our book. And how you support the staff in being able to then translate that into, okay, so if we're talking about oracy in terms of teaching and learning, we're thinking about think, pair, share, and turn and talk, and cold calling, and say it again, but say it better. When we're thinking about oracy and literacy, we're thinking about reciprocal reading, we're thinking about echo reading. When we're thinking about disciplinary oracy, this is what we mean in terms of talking like a scientist, or talking like a theologian, or an artist. So I think following that work, the opportunity for an exploration of the research through a disciplinary lens is really sensible. And the opportunity for the middle leaders to map out CPD and put together an oracy CPD curriculum which enhances and enriches the subject. So say, for example, in history, a middle leader might put together a CPD program for how to kind of, develop history teaching within their department. For example, teaching the second order concepts in a stronger way, causation, interpretations. But during those CPD sessions, the role of talk will be purposefully woven into that and planned. So when we're developing our skills of how to teach causation, we'll also include how to get the students to talk and explain the causes, and card sort the different causes, and then justify through conversation which one was the more important and how we can interlink them, and how to agree and challenge one another before forming their overall judgment. And then I think in that way, practitioners can see that this is not a talk activity to bolt on, but it's actually leading to more powerful generative learning. And obviously that's going to take time. So I think being really sensible with your middle leaders and thinking about it as a 3-year plan, a 4-year plan. You're not going to do it all in a year. It's that gentle kind of growth and development over time, and how you can use kind of mechanisms such as listening walks and opportunities for feedback to support the middle leaders in responsibly developing their CPD and curriculum, so that it does lead to those long-term lasting shifts.
I literally don't think I have anything to add to that answer because it was so thorough. I think just to pick up on a couple of things, I think it's about the curriculum coming first and oracy strategies then coming afterwards. I think there is a danger at the moment that it is seen as the latest fad. You know, Labour are talking about it and kind of prioritising it a bit more, and it's what you don't want is schools doing, like Alex has said, no pen days, or just saying to everyone, you must use a think, pair, share every lesson, that kind of thing. And it just becoming gimmicky. It's got to be very, very carefully planned for. And in order to do that, the systemic shift that, you know, you answered in your question is there's got to be a lot more CPD around oracy to begin with. Teachers have got to understand what we mean when we say oracy, because I just think that, as Alex has said, it's not something I was ever explicitly taught about. It's not even something I explicitly did any training on in my school as a teaching and learning lead, because I guess we felt we had other priorities. So I do think it is a bit of a training gap at the moment. Yeah, we want to avoid it becoming the new fad, the new gimmick.
And I think it's great that in the new ITT and ECF framework, which is coming out in 2025, that oracy has, you know, a stronger kind of position within it. But as Rachel said, it's about really being clear about what oracy is, because what we don't want is this kind of generic research that kind of sits at the top in a training program, and that then mentors who perhaps haven't had access to training in their own progression aren't then able to support the ITT or ECT to then translate that within their context, within their subject. And so I think what we've got to do is really think carefully about how we can support people of different experiences in varying career stages to be able to access it in a way that aligns with a common vision.
I mean, I think you're absolutely spot on, because like the first national curriculum I started teaching with had speaking and listening as part of the literacy, and then it was removed in 2012. And equally with maths, the oracy, there was a communication progression as part of the national strategies, which sort of outlined your sort of what they thought was the typical journey, and they just sort of disappeared. And I think, you know, the argument was that it would still happen in schools, but if you guys are noticing that over that time, actually, it seems there seems to be some sort of disintegration, and then clearly that deprioritization was, you know, even if it wasn't intentional, has taken place. I mean, have you noticed, Rachel, in your work with schools prioritizing this? Because I know the Stat Lab schools are really, really sensible schools. So are they thinking in this way? And in terms of prioritization, Alex, I was talking to Tom Oakley on last week's episode, and he mentioned the process he went through to choose his priority, the first thing to sort of explore as deputy head teacher. How do schools know when oracy is one of the highest priority elements, or is it very specific to the school? So there's almost two questions, one for each of you.
I think, just picking up on something that Alex said, I think behaviour is a big issue here for lots of teachers. They, even though they might have some understanding of oracy strategies and scaffolding techniques, I think sometimes there's a fear factor in allowing students to talk because of the behaviour that might result. So I think I wouldn't say it's a priority necessarily from school leaders that I speak to, but there is definitely a feeling that they want talk when it happens to be purposeful. So looking at the routines around talk that, you know, that you have to have in place first for the talk to be meaningful, I think is something we are definitely seeing schools asking for support with, and knowing how to lead CPD on those particular steps, for example.
Yeah, I think it's like, looking at it, I think, as Rachel said, it's about having those routines in place, and actually how are you going to codify those across a school? So are there going to be kind of like agreed rules when it comes to talk? You know, is there going to be, you know, a signal, pause, insist? And then, you know, when you're doing think, pair, share, is it going to be, you know, that you use a DNA kind of strategy with that? So, you know, your duration, etc. So I think schools will kind of get a sense of what their priorities are, but what they can do is they can still chip away at oracy by things like, if you are focusing on behaviour, then this year looking at those rules for talk and giving your middle leaders and departments time to research behind the scenes, what does disciplinary oracy mean, and those sorts of things, because we can't expect them to be suddenly 100% knowledgeable and experts about, you know, if someone was to say to me right now, okay, summarize what disciplinary oracy is in history, I'm going to have to take time to think about it. And then how does that translate into the curriculum that we've got? I think in such a high accountability culture, there can be this drive to do everything all at once and be experts at it. And I think what we've got to do is really think about a sensible long-term plan, looking at what your priorities are and where the development of oracy can complement. But also, just because we're not making it front and center of our CPD in terms of whole school or whatever, it doesn't mean that we can't be doing the groundwork behind the scenes, laying the foundations for future. So we've got a 3-year literacy development plan in my school, which actually I have interestingly just elongated to 4 because I feel responsibly that we need that additional time to further secure some kind of aspects of it. And so for me, we decided that reading was year 1, that explicit vocabulary instruction is year 2, and then it would be writing would be year 3, and the oracy would be interwoven between them. So as we're doing reading, we're looking at reciprocal reading, which is questioning, it's about summarizing and all those kind of different aspects of it. So what I did there was oracy wasn't like, we are doing oracy, but what I did was I aligned it with what I'm doing with teaching and learning and what I'm doing with reading. And again, this year, when our teaching and learning focus has been attention, that's what we've been focusing on. I very much said, yes, we're looking at cognition and attention, but also that means that our teacher explanation, so teacher dialogue, our oracy needs to be really strong. So I think there's a way of kind of marrying up your priorities with it side by side. And I think that will again prevent it from being, oh, it's another bolt on, it's a different focus. I mean that you can make progress with it whilst also, featuring on things like behavior and stuff like that. And I think that helps to stop staff from feeling overwhelmed. And I think that comes back to as well when I was talking about really being clear with staff about oracy. So it might be that your focus 1 year is checks for understanding and formative assessment, and that's going to be your golden thread. Well, you're doing oracy within that, are you not? Because when you're doing turn and talk, when you're doing things like cold calling, there's dialogic within there, there's exploratory within there. And I think just saying to staff, that is oracy. You are doing that. And again, I think that stops them from thinking it's this whole different universe or galaxy that's coming, when actually it's there to complement and enhance what we're already doing.
Yeah, I think just picking up on a point there as well, I think that idea of going really slowly and not overloading teachers with different strategies is super important. If you take even something like turn and talk, well, what are you asking students to turn and talk and discuss? Are they discussing, or are you just checking for their understanding? How long are you giving them to do that? Are you asking to think during that time as well? It's so much is involved in even just running a turn and talk, that I think you can't overload teachers with lots of different strategies. It's just got to be drip fed over time. But I think, like Alex has said, that golden thread that it's going to feature in whatever your CPD priority is, oracy will be a part of it because students will be talking at some point.
Yeah, I think that's gold, because essentially, if all of a sudden we're an oracy school, that's a red flag for faddism, isn't it? And it's what we know about how effective change management in schools, and where does this complement us? I think that's going to be really, really powerful, because what concerns me, and maybe it's the social platforms that I'm using, is when you see these grand announcements and you're thinking, oh my goodness, what has been sacrificed in its name. So I think you guys have done a really fantastic job of explaining a really careful, considered approach to utilizing this. I think that's absolutely fantastic. You warned that less is truly more with oracy scaffolds, and this really interested me, and that over-engineering them can hinder participation. Can you share an example of how simplifying a scaffold might transform pupil engagement?
The one that I've gone for is oracy sentence starters. So that's the kind of the one that I've gone, because as I mentioned before, we are in a high accountability culture, and I think that sometimes due to that we can push ourselves to be expert at everything all at once, and that everything has to be signposted to hell so that it's evidence. So if someone comes in, you're doing oracy, it's in your books and that sort of thing. And so I think in some cases it could be the case that we lead to overly complex formulaic sentence starters, as scaffolds, which can then lead to clunky, rigid conversations over time, particularly when it comes to exploratory talk. they're thinking about the content, and rather than perhaps a natural flow of kind of that, it's that they're like, well, I would agree because of, and then they're trying to marry up the two, and that can make it a little bit. And I think that might be a little bit off-putting in some ways. So actually, the scaffold can sometimes be the hinder to it. So I think sentence starters can either be really powerful, or they can actually do the opposite, and your knowledge of the children will know what's appropriate for them. Because, as I said, students may struggle to attach their thoughts to these given sentence starters. They're relying on them perhaps too much. And so I think, yes, perhaps, use sentence starters judiciously as scaffolds, but then also just simplify it. Just things like formative phrasing in our questioning and their responses to build that participation. So why might this be the case? That word might means that there's not a definitive answer. And I think that can then open up the way to kind of participation. And then, that gives them the opportunity to say, it might be that, it could be that, as opposed to them kind of setting their kind of like, putting up their flag, this is what I believe, and that can be quite vulnerable. So I think it allows for that kind of more exploratory talk rather than kind of having it kind of really hindered. And I think, sometimes it's just as simple as you posing a question rather than having the sentence starter scaffolds. It's just having a mini whiteboard for them to jot down their ideas, and then just having that as an aid memoir for when they're discussing their things, because it's sometimes not how they start it. It's just kind of having that logical flow of what they're going to say. And I think that can perhaps be, I think with presentational talk, there is perhaps the opportunity for greater use of those sentence scaffolds, like that sort of thing is how you're going to. But I think when it comes to exploratory, less is more, in terms of just giving them that opportunity to be more, have that psychological safety, or that culture of error, that it's okay to not have the right answer and things like that. So that's the one that I've gone for.
And I think sometimes teachers rush to do very complicated scaffolds, and actually just get the basics right. Just get students really using, basic, answering in a full sentence, or, referring to key vocabulary in their answers. Those basic scaffolds, get them right first, and then you can add more complexity as students become more independent and more confident, but don't rush to do too much at once.
I remember whenever I saw your talk on this, Rachel, I can't remember which research ed we were at, but there were no gimmicks in your recommendations. It was, here's what might be appropriate in this situation. So that's clearly what's coming through here.
When you write your review for the book, I want no gimmicks.
No gimmicks. Okay, remind me of that closer to the. I'll do that. Yeah, and it was just really sensible advice on how we should behave in the classroom as practitioners, and the things that can help our learners. Because those it's almost like when people become dependent on something, the removal, which we'll get to in the sort of next question, becomes really difficult. The mathematical equivalent, because I keep harping on about maths, is probably like the times table square, because you're not really, it's an aid, but when you take it away, the paucity of knowledge of the times tables and the automatic recall, it's still a massive issue for the pupil. Yeah, I think that makes total sense. And I think it does feed into our last question, because across both strands, you really emphasize planning for the removal of scaffolds, which I think is something that doesn't get talked about enough. Obviously you guys are changing that. What indicators tell you that a particular scaffold is ready to come away?
So I think the first point is that you won't know 100%. And I think we have to get comfortable with that as professionals. You might make mistakes. You might remove a scaffold and then realise that you need to put some more scaffold back in, and that students just weren't ready for that next independent step. But I think that is the first part of the puzzle. You have to plan to remove the scaffold. I think that is absolutely key. Too many teachers plan to put the scaffolding in and never do the planning to remove it. And then, like, picking up on what you just said a minute ago, Tom Sherrington calls it an illusion of learning, that you think that students are understanding everything and they're becoming confident, independent learners. And then they walk into the test where they haven't got any scaffolding, and you realise that actually it was an illusion. So you have to plan for the removal. But you won't necessarily get it right. You have to look for those indicators that are going to come from your checks for understanding. And this is why, we place great emphasis when we talk about scaffolding in formative assessment and checking for understanding throughout. And when you put the scaffold in and when you remove it, it's based on that responsive teaching. It is not, I can't say, 3 weeks into my scheme of learning, I'm then going to definitely remove that scaffold. I might think that might be a logical place to start to remove it, but I won't know for sure. I have to almost take my cues from the students when I'm in the lessons, have a go, and then put the scaffold back in if I need to. But what you're essentially looking for is growing independence, growing understanding from students, and going slowly. So we talk about this quite a lot because we can see some lethal mutations of I do, we do, you do at times. For example, if we're talking about modelling as a scaffold, and teachers rushing through, well, I need to be at the we do part of my lesson now, or I need to be into the I do. And actually, as we've talked about, modelling needs to be possibly I do, we do, maybe back to an I do, another we do, before you then move to a you do. And it's got to be completely responsive. And you can plan for that process, but you won't know until you're in the moment with those students in front of you. And that's why it does take a certain amount of expertise and experience, hence why super difficult, which we're hoping to try and help with in the book. But I think ultimately it is about knowing your students and doing lots of checks for understanding.
Yeah, I think to build on that, actually it was Rachel's first piece in TES that I saw about kind of scaffolding, which I find really useful. In terms of when we're looking at scaffolding, we're looking at heavy, medium, and light scaffolding, and how actually, it might be that we start off with like for some students a really heavy piece of scaffolding and looking at that graduated approach of how actually then it might go down to a medium, but then actually it's a new interpretation, it's a lot harder, so back up to the heavy and that sort of thing. So I think that is quite a useful kind of way of kind of articulating that kind of gradual phase of kind of like scaffolding. It's not like all of a sudden you're going to have like a writing frame and then nothing. Like, you are going to graduate that away over time as appropriate, and then put it back in when as appropriate. And I think that as you see the children's confidence and autonomy developing through your checks for understanding and things like that, you'll begin to know how to scale it down that kind of like ladder, but then also when to kind of scale it back up. So we've done something in the book. So I basically just ripped off Rachel's idea. Don't worry, it's credited. In the reading chapter, where I look at reciprocal reading and I look at heavy, medium, and light. And again, I think that's something which, because it was originally Rachel applied that across kind of history, I think that's something which could be useful in terms of how you could use that within CPD in terms of what that gradual release looks like. Because in the end, we do want them to be independent and autonomous. And I think particularly for early career teachers, that could be a useful kind of thing to work with them on to help them to understand the differences between those subtle nuances that we do within a subject as we begin to remove those scaffolds.
I think for me, the continuum, if you like, or the head, thinking about scaffolding with levels is a really helpful starting point. But we always, in the book and when we do presentations on this, we do like put a note of caution there, because I think it is open to that mutation of people going, right, well, I'm going to heavy scaffold in this lesson and I'm going to reduce my scaffolding in this lesson, or going back to those old dark days of differentiation, which I know we've spoken about previously, of predetermining what scaffolding those students are going to need. So it's marrying the idea of kind of having those awareness of your barriers that those students face, and thinking about when you're going to put the scaffolding in, when you're going to remove it, with a like graduated approach, but also being responsive to what you actually see in front of you. And it might be that students understand something a lot quicker than you expect, and that you can move through those stages much more quickly. But we mustn't mutate and go back to the rigid approach of differentiation and kind of predetermining what students are capable of.
Absolutely. We don't want it to be that gold, silver, bronze suddenly becomes heavy, medium, and light.
No, You know.
This is going to be immense because I mean, I'm actually right now I got the same feeling I had when I saw you speak about it and when we all chatted about it last year. I think this is going to be a massive difference to the teachers who read this book. So I really hope it's in the many, the upper echelons of EduBook, because you can see how this is going to tie together with everything with the conversation we've been having over the last decade, maybe decade and a half, and how it can incrementally improve our practice in so many different ways. And I think what you guys have done is a really good job of articulating both the why, the what, and the how. So I've said it a million times, can't wait. Very ready, but certain that this is going to be massive. Certainly, it's going to be really, really powerful. The metrics aren't everything, but the power of individual practice is the goal, isn't it?
It's very kind, thank you.
We look forward to ordering about 20 books then.
Listen, if I'm ordering anybody's books, I'm ordering my books. I've never had an Amazon #1. I've always, those draw around the lines maths books where did you get kids? That's always #1 in my section. So I have no hope of when they practice their handwriting and digit formation or the whiteboards. But I definitely will be telling everyone I can in school about why they need to read this. So looking forward to it. So it's been fascinating chatting with you. So I'll see you guys next May at the very latest. We have got to that Bay Cymru on the 27th of September. So this is just my reminder for everyone that they can start buying tickets now, with the proceeds going back to Belinda again. So maybe see you guys there. But if not, I'll see you in May. All I have to do is say thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having us again. Thank you.
And to everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.